Hello everybody, and welcome to Yoshi1 Kenobi's review of JumpStart, the white cards of JumpStart, from the point of view of historic playability. So we'll be going over all the different themes that contain white creatures. We'll also cover the colorless creatures, the colorless artifacts, and all the lands that are associated with these themes. So there are 9 themes: Angels, Basri, Doctor, Dogs, Enchanted, Feathered Friends, Heavily Armored, and Legion of Unicorns. So we're going to cover these themes, and I'm going to present to you all the rares and mythic rares, and I'll also review some commons and uncommons that I think will be relevant in the historic metagame, or could have some uses. First of all, there are 14 new rare cards and 3 new rare mythic cards that show up in these white themes. In terms of reprints, there are 7 rares and 2 mythic rares that are reprinted. So you get a little over more than half of the cards are going to be new to the historic format. Let's start with our first theme, Angels. So there's only one card of rare or higher rarity in Angels that is new, which is Linvala, Keeper of Silence. It's a 3/4 flying for 4, fairly good stats, that says activated abilities of creatures your opponent control can't be activated, which is an ability that either does absolutely nothing or can be fairly good. It really depends on the matchup. As such, I see this card as being a role player in certain matchups, kind of a 2-of in the sideboard that you bring in the metagame when your opponent has a whole lot of activated ability. But overall, it's really going to be a 3/4 flying for 4, which is a little subpar for historic. Speaking of big flyers, we have Emancipation Angel, which is a 3/3 flying for 3. Now we're getting into interesting stats. But it comes with a downside. When Emancipation Angel enters the battlefield, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. Or is it? If you build your deck around Emancipation Angel a little bit, with a bunch of permanents that you can bounce back in your hand and get more value, like the Almonds, for example, and Yorion, which also has a similar effect, then suddenly you have a 3/3 flyer for 3 with benefits, which is very powerful. So I expect to see this card in the historic metagame in some shape or form. Then we have Guardian Idol, which is a 2-mana rock, very similar to the Mind Stone, which we currently have. But instead of the ability to sack it to draw a card, you can pay 2 mana for it to become a 2/2 Golem artifact creature. So it depends on whether you want to apply pressure with your artifact or draw more cards. You probably want to draw more cards. So this is going to be kind of another option to Mind Stone. Probably not played as much, but if you want more of that effect, then Guardian Idol might be the card for you. I also brought in a common, Angelic Page, which is a 2-mana flying 1/1 that taps so that target attacking or blocking creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It's not a very good card, but it's a 2-mana Angel, which is very rare. So if you're building some kind of Angel tribal and there's Angel synergies that you want to bring forward, then Angelic Page is a card in your arsenal that you can bring in for those very specific strategies. The second theme is Basri, which really just contains reprinted rares and mythics, namely Basri Ket and Basri's Lieutenant. 2 fairly good cards, but it depends on whether you've already collected them in M21 or not. In terms of Doctors, which is the next theme, we get Speaker of the Heavens reprinted, and we get 3 new rares. The first one is Cradle of Vitality. So it's an enchantment for 4. Whenever you gain life, you may pay 2. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature for each 1 life you've gained. It's fairly slow as a card. Not only do you have to pay 4 to get that effect, you also need to pay 2 mana every time you want to use it. So you can think of it as a very slow Veto or a very slow Heliod, in that it It helps you with +1/+1 counters whenever you life gain, and it scales with how much life you've gained, but it's very, very expensive. Now, we don't have that many Hellion effects in the game right now, so having one or two Cradle of Vitality might be a way to help get multiple copies of that effect into play, but I don't think it's going to be much of a role player. Maybe the odd one of now and then, simply because it's very slow. Next we have Path of Bravery, enchantment for 3. As long as your life total is greater or equal than your starting life total, creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever one or more creatures you control attack, you gain life equal to the number of attacking creature. So for the first part of the effect, this is strictly inferior to Glorious Anthem that we've gotten in M21, except for the slightly more lenient cost, where you only need single white instead of double white. So you have to compensate with the life gain from Path of Bravery. If you're playing a life gain deck where your life really matters, maybe with Speaker of the Heavens, maybe with Heliod, with Johnny's Pridemate, maybe Path of Bravery has a place there. So it's really kind of a hybrid between a life gain card and an Anthem, and it's going to play a bit of both roles. I think it's going to see some play in that very specific life gain niche as a couple of copies, something like that. Next we have Rock's Fate Mender. It's a 1/5 life linker for 4. If you would gain life, gain twice that much life instead. In the past, that card's been very good at stopping red deck wins or very aggressive strategy. The 5 points of toughness and the fact that you heal for 2 while blocking is very relevant against these aggressive matchups. Now, the fact that you double up life gain also means that you can do some kind of cheese with veto and other life gain shenanigans. So I think it's going to be playing both roles, making fans happy with veto, fate menders, spam to gain a whole bunch of life and then drain your opponent, and as an actual blocker for very aggressive strategies. In particular, it can block 4/4s, 4/4 haste creatures like a breeze. And the other card which I want to talk about is Stonehaven Pilgrim. So it's an uncommon for 2. It's a 2-mana 2/2. Standard baseline for stats. Whenever it attacks, if you control an artifact or enchantment, it gains +1/+1 and lifelink until end of turn. So in a deck where you play a lot of artifacts or enchantments, and you're very likely to have one on turn 1, then Stonehaven Pilgrim becomes a 3/3 lifelinker, which is very good baseline stats, especially in white. It's the type of stats that you'd expect from a green card. White typically doesn't have that much access to 3/3 lifelinkers for 2. So I think this card might have some niche plays in decks where you play a lot of artifacts or enchantments very early on in the game. Then again, it's going to have to compete with Adanto Vanguard, but I think it's a card to keep in mind. The next team is Dogs. So we are getting Isamaru, Hound of Konda, which is a 2/2 for 1. Extremely good stats. It's a legendary dog, and that plays both against it and in favor of it. So you probably don't want to play 4 Isamarus simply because you're going to be stuck paying for that legendary rule. On the upside, well, it's probably not a card that you want. Well, I was going to say it's not a card you want as a commander, but if you play it as a commander, then you have that 1-drop guaranteed every game, so you can cut 1-drops completely from your deck, reliably have that 1-drop, and then 2-drop and curve out fairly well. So that's one of the roles it can play. Another role is now we currently have 2 legendary 1-drops in 1, which means that Mox Amber can be used as a ramp spell for white weenies, which can be quite scary. Isamaru, Mox Amber, other 1-drop into a turn 2 Benalish Marshal, for example, or History of Benalia, is quite scary. So I'd keep that in mind, and legendary actually plays an upside there. We also have Thalia for 2, which is a legendary creature which fits well in White Weenie strategy. So I expect White Weenies will get a pretty good boost out of Isamaru. In terms of Dog Tribal, well, we know that Pack Leader is really good. Isamaru is fairly good. I'm not sure if we have quite enough support in Dogs yet, but it's an archetype that we need to keep an eye on. It has a couple of powerful cards. It's just missing a couple of fillers in the rest of the curve. Right now they're release the dogs for 4 mana, which creates 4 dogs. Alright. That's decent considering we have Pack Leader, which is a lord that's going to boost all our dogs. But really there's not quite enough support for release the dogs to really be that great. But 4/1/1s for 4 is still something to keep in mind. In particular, there's a new enchantment that whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on each other creatures. That means that Release the Dog is going to create 4/5/5s. It's actually 4/4/4s, because it's on each other creature. Which is still pretty good value. 16 power and toughness for 4 is something that needs to be taken seriously. The next theme is Enchanted. The first one is the Celestial Mantle. Now, based on the picture, that mantle is some kind of exoskeleton of ethereal armor. And it looks awesome. So what does it do? It enchants creature, gives it +3/+3. Whenever it deals combat damage to player, double its controller's life total. Now, if that didn't cost 6, it would be fantastic. Now that it does cost 6, it's another card that's going to be playing mind games with the opponent with a veto, because doubling your life total, then draining your opponent for for however many life +3 you had. Oh no, it doesn't give lifelink. Well, anyways, you get the idea. You can drain a lot with that. So there are some very niche places where you can play the Celestial Mantle, but overall you don't really want to play 6 mana for an enchantment that you'll put on a creature that'll get removed, and then you've wasted a ton of mana for absolutely nothing and wasted a card. Speaking of putting enchantments on stuff, Core Spirit Dancer. A 2 mana 0/2. That doesn't look like much. It gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. And whenever you cast an aura spell, you may draw a card. Now this is some candy. It's an amazing card. So we already have kind of a Lurus deck right now where you stack a bunch of enchantments on creatures, and you get to recur these enchantments when they go down using that Lurus. You also have Eidolon of Alseid Bounty, which can give you protection, is an enchantment. You have enchantment synergies. Core Spirit Dancer plays into that. Not only does it become huge very, very fast, but it also keeps you running with gas because you keep on drawing every time you play an aura spell. So this is a very powerful card in that strategy. Next we have Face of Divinity, a 3 mana enchantment aura. Enchanted creature has +2/+2. As long as an other aura is attached to a creature, it has first strike and lifelink. So +2/+2, first strike, lifelink. That's fairly decent. Not sure how it competes with the other enchantments that we have right now. 3 is typically a bit more than what you want to pay. But First Strike and Lifelink is definitely something that's pretty good. So I'd expect that card to see some play. Next on our list, we have the Feathered Friends. So number 1, we have the Steel Plume Marshal, a 5 mana 3/3 flying. Then whenever it attacks, other attacking creatures you control with flying get +2/+2 until end of turn. It's another one of these. You need to spend 5 mana for a creature with relatively weak baseline stats. And when you do get, and you need to attack with it, and have other creatures on the battlefield with flying for the ability to kick in, these are very rare circumstances. And the +2/+2 is not worth the sacrifice of playing that subpar 5-drop. So this card is going to go in your binder and into a box in your basement, and will probably never see the light of day again. Next we have the Angel of Dire Hour, a 7 mana 5/4 flash flying. When you cast it, if you cast it from your hand, exile all attacking creatures. Now the effect on that card is very powerful. You basically get to settle the wreckage, but your opponent doesn't get the lands. So it's a board wipe on a body, but it's very expensive. 7 mana is probably a little much. At 5 mana, this would be broken. At 6 mana, this would see play. At 7 mana, you're pushing your luck. So I think it's going to be rough to play Angel of Dire Hour in a competitive deck. But if you ramp enough, especially with all the ramps that we have in Historic, you might be able to get away with it as a top end of your curve. So it's kind of your finisher, and it acts as removal, so it does everything. So because it's so versatile, it might see play as a 1 or 2 of in a ramp control type of list. But I don't think it's quite good enough. Next we have Archon of Redemption, a 5 mana 3/4 flying. Whenever Archon of Redemption or another creature with flying enter the battlefield under your control, you may gain life equal to that creature's power. So that's the Grey Merchant of White with better stats and a weaker ability. Probably not going to see much play as just purely gaining life while keeping that 3/4 in play. Gaining life isn't an ability that you want to stack on that much on the big flying, on the 5-drop. So I don't think this is going to see play. It's going to join the Steel Plume Marshal in the box in the basement, next to most commons. Next we have Archon of Justice, a 5 mana 4/4 flying. When it dies, exile target permanent. Now this is definitely the strongest one of the 5/5 flyers. Well, the 5 mana flyers. Because it gets to exile anything, including a land, which, as we've seen with Agent of Treachery, being able to target lands with these types of effect is very strong. If you can put it in some kind of revival loop, you can do some serious damage with it. Just standalone, it's fairly decent. It's 4/4 for 5 flying is an okay body. The ability is fairly good. It's going to trade with anything. So I could see that card seeing play. It's not an exciting card. It's just okay, but it might be good enough. And I think it's on the border of being good enough. There might be some kind of shenanigans you can do with it. That where if you get to double the effect on Death Trigger, you'll find a way to recur it, exile and sacrifice it for a good cause. There's probably some applications to the Archon of Justice. Next, we have the heavily armored team. So the first heavily armored creature is Mikaeus the Lunarch, which is basically a priest in very thin robes, which for some reason counts as heavily armored because of the +1/+1 counters, which is what they meant by heavily armored. So it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters, similar to Stonecoil Serpent that we have. You can tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can remove a +1/+1 counter from it, and put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. Now this is a pretty powerful card. It's a type of card that you can cast early. It can grow itself. It can grow your other creatures. It's a threat that keeps on threatening in multiple ways. In particular, if you pair it up with a Conclave Mentor, then you can do some pretty degenerate things. Same thing with Wildwood Scourge and everything that synergizes with +1/+1 counters, because the Lunarch is your friend. Played in a copy or in a couple of copies, because it acts as a 2-drop, but it also scales with your curve. so it's fairly good. You can also play it in go wide strategies and just boost your team. If you need to go big, you can just level it up itself. Fairly versatile card. Does a good job at multiple aggro things in white. Next we have Katara's Crusade, a 5-mana enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So the effect is pretty strong. If you start playing a bunch of creatures, or even worse, if you start playing token producers, for example, a March of the Multitude on the Katara's Crusade is going to be hilarious. March for 7, I suddenly have 7/8/8s on the battlefield. Or that dog creating card that we talked about earlier. You create 4 5/5s. It's pretty good. The downside is that you waste your turn on 5 mana, where Katara's Crusade doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield. And these types of effects are typically a little weaker, but because you're going to grow your field so much the next turn if you build around it, it's probably one of the cards that we'll see play. In particular, we have a lot of cards that transform tokens into angels or that care about tokens. I would see that card in a I care about token deck as a redundant effect that's going to end the game on your next token making effect. Next, we have Duelist's Heritage, an enchantment for 3, which basically says whenever you attack with a creature, you get to give double strike to one of your attacking creatures. It's a do nothing card, so when it enters the battlefield, well, actually, that's not true. If you have creatures in play, it's going to do something. It's going to give double strike to a creature. Now, we've seen cards like Embercleave give double strike to a creature and be devastating. Okay, +1/+1 double strike trample after blocks, which is much better. But the Duelist Heritage is actually going to stick, and you don't need to re-equip it to another creature. So I think it's similar to Embercleave in some sense. It's cheaper to cast. You can reliably cast it for 3 because that's its cost. And you don't need to re-equip it. So if you're playing a bunch of creatures with haste in your deck, you're always going to have a creature with double strike attacking. And double strike can be doubly devastating. So I can see it have some play, maybe in the Naya build, where you have all those Gruul's hasters, and you need to punch through for a little bit more damage. Probably a 1 of or a 2 of. It's not going to be a mainstream card, but it's probably playable. Then we have High Sentinels of Arashin, a 3/4 flying for 4 that enters the battlefield. That gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. And you can pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This is a draft card. In standard, it's a moderately big flyer that's likely to get removed. And that's about what it is. There are better options for 4 mana, so this should not see play in Historic. In the Legion theme, we have the Blessed Sanctuary, a 5 mana enchantment. It says prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you and creatures you control. Okay, so you have protection from burn spells. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 white unicorn creature. So you have 2 effects that are pretty much completely different. They're not that good individually, and they're not that good combined. Basically, you want to play this if your opponent is very heavy on burn spells, and somehow the burn is aimed at your creature and you need to protect your creature. I'm having difficulty seeing usages for it. At 4, maybe you can start using it as protection against burn spells. At 5, your opponent's already going to be using burn spells here and there. It might still be useful as a defense against burn, uh, but it feels relatively weak. Then we have the King of Unicorn, Emiel the Blessed, which is the mythic rare in the Unicorns team. A 4 mana 4/4 with 2 abilities. First one, you get a pay 3 to flicker an allied creature you control. So you exile it, returns to the battlefield under its owner's control to re-trigger enter the battlefield effects, or to do or to dodge removal or something like that. It's another creature, so it can't protect itself, which is a downside, but it has solid stats. Also, the second ability, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on it. If it's a unicorn, put 2. Alright, so that's also a decent ability. It's a mana sink, and 1 mana for +1/+1 counter is actually fairly decent. Again, if you have something like a Conclave Mentor or some other +1/+1 matter cards, then this is a bonus. So it has a solid baseline, a good flicker ability, a good mana sink ability that grows your creature. It doesn't have any enter the battlefield ability. It's not groundbreaking. It's just a solid 4-drop. And I'm not sure a solid 4-drop is what most decks want to play in Historic, but it's definitely good enough to be included in some decks. 4 is kind of the key mana spot where you'd expect a little bit more of your creature, but whenever they have a wall of text, it's kind of like Questing Beast. If you add enough text to a creature, then it's gonna be good enough to see some play. And that concludes our review of the white cards for JumpStart that are going to be meaningful in Historic. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Leave your comment below and don't forget to subscribe to support this channel and keep the awesome videos coming.